Hi everybody, in this video we talk about RGB SCART cable. For those of you who want to know more information what's special about this cable, pros and cons, this video is for you. I got my first cable for the Sega Master System from retrogamingcables.co.uk. Now when I got my TV, the seller actually put this and other cables, and basically this is an adapter. It takes either composite or CA or its video and send it to a SCART connector. Basically the yellow is a composite video that carries the picture, and the red and white carries the audio signal for the left and right channels. Now the S-video offers a better picture quality in general than the yellow RCA, the composite cable, because it separates the black and white brightness and color signals, resulting in sharper image with less color bleeding. Now RCA basically describes the shape of the plug, and composite describes the type of signal running through the cable. Now the reason it's composite is because a video signal is made of several parts: brightness, color, and synchronization pulses. In this composite format, all these pieces are electronically composited into a single complex analog signal. Now this is a RGB SCART cable for the Sega Master System 1 that I bought from retrogamingcables.co.uk. There's one connector that connects to the Sega Master System and another one that connects to the Euro SCART connector in my Sony Trinitron CRT. So why this cable is considered a better cable, and better in exactly what, and does it have any disadvantages? I mean, from a retro gaming perspective. Now, before we talk more about that, I want to talk about the different sync cables. So first of all, RGB SCART needs a sync signal so the TV monitor knows when each line and frame starts. Without sync, the image will just roll, tear, or not lock at all. So here are the main ways sync is carried RGB SCART from the best to worst, from top to bottom. We have C-Sync, as you can see, composite sync, which is considered the best. A clean, dedicated sync signal, no video data mixed in, give the sharpest, most stable image, preferred by PVM and BVMs, scalers like RetroTink or OSSC, and Pro monitors. And you can of course just pause it and read the description for each one as well. But basically the idea is that you get the cleanest signal that give you the sharpest, most stable image. I'm not saying this is the desirable thing all the time. I'm going to talk about this in a moment. Now the cable that I bought from retrogamingcables.co.uk is a C-Sync one. Now as you can see, there are also some monitors that require C-Sync in order to function. So again, we established that RGB has an advantage because it has a separation between the signals. With composite video, it meshes both color and brightness signals into a single wire, causing dot crawl and bleeding. RGB send them separately. In a moment, I'm going to show you actual comparison so you can see how it looks very close if you do a micro shot on a CRT. So you can see, for example, composite video, you see the data is on a single cable mixed, can lead to noise, and RGB SCART send the signals separately. Now you can see the connectors here on the right. There are 21 in total. However, the pin 21 is actually the metal outer shell, the shield of the connector itself, so not a small pin inside. Now you can see on the left, this is from Wikipedia, what each pin actually is responsible for. Alright, this is another version, easier for you to read. Again, you can just pause and read if you want to learn more about what each pin is responsible for. Now it's worth mentioning that SCART wasn't available for all TVs. Actually, SCART was overwhelmingly popular in Europe, where it was standard connector for decades. In France, for example, it was mandatory on all TVs sold from 1980 to 2015, and in Europe it became de facto standard across most of Western and Eastern Europe, including the UK, Germany, Italy, Spain, and others. Now, it was mentioning that in Japan they had a physically identical but electrically incompatible connector called JP21. It looked like SCART but was wired differently. And this is essential that you buy the right cable, because otherwise you can just fry your electronics. Now in the United States it was virtually non-existent. The US used RCA, composite, and S-video, and later component inputs instead. Now, it's important to know that back in the days, not everybody, well, they were using SCART cables, SCART connector, but it didn't always get the RGB quality. For example, they use, a cheap one. It was the most common. People use cables, cheap SCART cables, they only had 3 wires inside. Even though it was a SCART plug, it was only sending the blurry composite signal, like the yellow plug quality that I showed you earlier for the RCA. And in order to get the maximum picture quality, you needed a fully wired SCART cable that actually connected the red, green, and blue pins, the pins 7, 11, and 15. And this is important for my point. So while everyone used the SCART plug, only those with better cables were actually using RGB SCART. Many gamers played for years not realizing they were looking at a blurry composite image through a SCART plug. Basically more or less like what I showed you earlier with the RCA connected to a SCART plug, more or less the same. Now you might ask, well, why we actually need to get an RGB SCART? In the past, not many people actually had one. Now if you bought, for example, consoles or a TV, you usually get the composite cable in the box, so that's actually what most people use. Now, why it's very important to know about that? Because if you measure things by today's standard when it comes to sharpness, color reproduction, and so on, and less noise, of course, SCART RGB SCART actually provides the best based on these measures. And composite can lead to dot curl, for example, kind of zipper or checkerboard pattern on the edges of objects, for example, especially the red and blue ones. Color bleeding, color smearing to neighboring pixels, and of course blurriness. The overall image is softer, hiding fine details like text or intricate pixel art. Now this is a comparison I made, and you can see it right in front of you, RGB SCART at the top, composite at the bottom. And you can clearly see a few things. We talk about actually why it's actually not maybe a bad thing, or not such a bad thing as some people say. You can see the highlights, for example, on the green, they look like highlights, whether on the SCART it's kind of more, it's sharper. Again, because of the bleeding, it looks more like highlighted circle, it's more three-dimensional. Just note that the cable itself is old, so again, it might not be even too much representative. Nonetheless, you can see here the composite is blurry. If you look at the, for example, the bushes and the building, you can see that it kind of smooths off the gradients. It makes everything kind of look smoother, even more three-dimensional. And this is because developers knew that most players will be using composite, especially in the US. So they design graphics relying on these, and again in quotation, flaws to create special effects that disappear in high quality RGB. You can see also that the contrast is lower here, the sharpness, it's blurrier on the composite. And they even use it to create new colors, basically faking colors, by just placing 2 different colored pixels next to each other, and the composite signal would smear them to create third color that the console couldn't natively produce. This was common on the Apple II, by the way, in CGA displays, but also used on the Sega Genesis and others. Aside from that, jagged pixel edges, especially for 3D games, they were naturally smoothed out by the blur, making low-resolution 3D games, like for example on the PS1 or Nintendo 64, look less blocky than they do on razor-sharp RGB or modern emulators. Now in this particular case, I'm not saying like this is a great cable, it might have some flaws maybe because of age. Still, I prefer the RGB SCART because it's sharper, contrast is better. It also will lead to less eye fatigue. I just couldn't look at the composite and play a game like that for a prolonged time, whether on the RGB SCART there was no issue. And many other things, for example, like the pots, for example, the composite look like they intended to look with the lead. You can also see here there's some artifacts here with the text compared to the SCART, which is super sharp. Even the heart, the highlights on the heart look better on the composite. It looks more highlighted. Even the axe, the handle looks normal. The other one on the RGB SCART kind of look much thicker. Quite surprised to see that. Now, of course, there are some things that might not be good, of course, in general, but you can definitely see the connection between how developers develop the games, not for this sharp RGB SCART result, but for the composite signal. Look at the highlights, for example, here. Look at the hearts, right? Overall, I just prefer the composite look. But maybe on a different cable, higher quality cable, it would be better, I'm saying. So, I mean, don't take this like as a perfect example. Now, for me, actually, I noticed it immediately. The sharpness, even the color looked different. This is another test of another game. And basically, I decided that I'm going to stay with a SCART RGB cable because I like the result better. Also, on this 14-inch screen, it also depends. When you buy a small display, the pixels actually look, I mean, the pixel, because again, it looks pixelated because of the Trinitron and the scan lines. It leads to really kind of fine looking result that really complement the pixel art, especially into the games. But if you take a look, for example, at a larger, let's say like a 25-inch CRT, you might like or not like the result you're actually seeing. Now, result may vary. For example, if you have a small CRT or big TV, consumer CRT, if you have a PVM or BVM, in general, if you get a consumer CRT, so a TV, it blends dithering, and many people like it because it hides the jagged edges and it feels more nostalgic to them. But at the same time, text can be blurry and colors can bleed, and it can have geometry issues like warped corners, for example, which are quite common. And if you take a BVM, for example, they are much clearer image than a TV, much less bloom, very distinct scan lines, or we say gap between the scan lines, vivid colors, and considered kind of the sweet spot for most retro enthusiasts. But this is something that, again, we weren't experiencing in the past. This is something that was trending relatively late, not something that people had at home and used to play in the 90s for sure. But these displays, by the way, are harder to find and can be quite expensive. You also have BVMs, for example, that are kind of the absolute sharpest image possible with perfect geometry and blacks. However, they can, for some, be too sharp. The scan lines might be so thick that the image can look dark and it breaks the dithering effect. Now, many of these professional displays don't use SCART connectors, but they have other connectors, usually BNC, that unlike SCART, which is again one big plug, BNC uses individual round twist lock plugs for every signal. So you need 4 separate cables plug in for video: red, green, blue, and the sync, also called RGBS. So even though many will recommend you to buy RGB SCART cables, some will say not to buy, or maybe you just should have both and see which one you prefer. There are various ones. Also beware of the JP21, as I mentioned, and make sure to ask the seller what is best for your particular setup. But nothing replaces the experience, right? Because I can just experience with different cables and see which one I prefer, and I told you my take on it. So I personally prefer the smoothness of composite, but in general, at least the cables that I have right now, I prefer playing with the RGB SCART. It's just the picture is clear. It's also really good for my 14-inch monitor. Maybe if I have a bigger one, a consumer CRT TV, I might like it or not. I know, I need to test it out. Yeah, so this is the information about RGB SCART. Now, hopefully you know better about this cable, what it does, what's the advantages and disadvantages. So there are things that are subjective and important to note. It can also change between different consoles, even from different games. You might prefer a slightly different setup to play certain games. But basically, that's it for this video. I hope you find this one useful. If so, let me know in the comment section if you have any questions. I see you in the next video. Make sure to subscribe as well. Cheers.